Our Bible word is Hebrews 4 verses 16. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The Epistle to the Hebrews. According to some early church sources, it was attributed to the Apostle Paul. For example, already from the 2nd century onwards, all of Paul's writings were collected together, and for some, this epistle was also added to this collection of Pauline epistles. But others in the early church also said they don't know who wrote this epistle. And for example, the early church father Origen, he said, but as to who actually wrote the epistle, God knows the truth of the matter. And that is quoted by Eusebius in his church history. So already in the early church there was question mark, who wrote this? And today scholars and theologians generally accept that Paul did not write this epistle, because the language is too different. The Greek grammar and style is too different. Also the theology is quite different if you compare it to Paul's epistles. So who wrote this? God knows who wrote this epistle. And also where he wrote it, for whom, we also do not know, because there's no real clues in the text. Maybe to people or Christians in Rome, because there's this reference to Rome towards the end of the epistle, etc. But exactly who wrote it and to where, which Christians this was aimed, we do not know. But what we can know is that it was aimed at Jewish Christians. And maybe it was written before the temple was destroyed, around 65 AD or so, because the author also writes as if the temple is still standing, the sacrificial system in the temple still operating, but it could also have been written quite after this, or after this time, or after the temple was destroyed. So it was aimed at the Jewish Christian audience. And what we do know is that they were being persecuted, they were being harassed. And there are different phases that you can recognize in the epistle what this community has gone through. And the earliest phase is where they were persecuted, they were harassed, their property was plundered. But at this time they remained faithful, not just to their Christian faith, but also to each other. And this we can go read in chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. If we go there, the author writes, "But recall the former days in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you become companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven." So yeah, the author writes to this earlier time period. He himself was in prison. They came to visit him also. And these Christians, their property was plundered. The city officials, whoever, turned a blind eye, and they were people around in the community. They were targets of abuse. And now, a little while later, this kind of harassment has continued, and it's difficult. And some started getting tired, and they started withdrawing from coming to Christian fellowship. And we can also read this in chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, where the author writes there, "Let us consider one another." And in verse 25, "Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another." So he says here, some are holding back, some are staying away from the Christian assemblies, and also some, they are still in prison, and it's becoming a burden to look after those in prison. Also in chapter 13 verses 3, the author writes about the present situation of believers. He says there, "Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also." So even at the time of writing, there were those imprisoned. So it was a difficult situation. Yeah, people are losing their faith. They are withdrawing. There are those in prison. The community is still being harassed on a continual basis. So now our author writes this epistle. It's actually more like a sermon. It's actually more like a homily. He's giving them encouragement. If you go right to the end of the epistle, to chapter 13, verses 22, he writes about, receive this word of exhortation. So this is to encourage them, so that they don't withdraw from the faith, etc. So now he also addresses them. He says, now again I must instruct you. You've become like children. Now we must teach you again all the first principles. If you go to chapter 5, verses 12, from verses 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. So the author also says, now it's like we're back at the beginning. You are withdrawing and you're losing your commitment to Christ. Now we must start from the beginning and teach you again. So that was a difficult situation. And also in chapter 11, for example, our author encourages these Christians. Remember the examples of the Old Testament. The patriarchs, those other figures he refers to. How they remained faithful to God. How they endured. Even though they did not receive the promise of rest that God has given to his people. So generally, this is a word of exhortation to Christians. Remain faithful. And the author also writes to convince these Christians Christ is superior to what they've known before. Do not go back to the Judaism that you knew. That is past now. The time of the new covenant has come. Christ is superior in several ways. And Christ is superior to the prophets, to the angels. He is superior to Moses, Israel's lawgiver. He is superior to Joshua. And Christ is also superior to the Aaronic priesthood and the whole Levitical sacrificial system. That was where people made or brought their sacrifices of atonement. That's where their sins were also removed through the priests who helped them with the sacrifices in the temple. But Christ is superior to this. Christ brought his once for all sacrifice. If we go read also in chapter 10, verses 10. By that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. In other words, Jesus, he made the sacrifice. So the work is done. No more sacrifices needs to be made. That's why Jesus is superior to this priesthood that operated in the temple. Also very important in the book of Hebrews is that it emphasizes the role of Jesus as the high priest. He replaces the old high priest. Jesus is now the mediator between God and the people. He is the one who offered himself. He brought his own body as a sacrifice of atonement. And because of that, he has become the high priest. Also the one who now is seated at God's right hand and who intercedes on behalf of God's people. So that's quite important. Jesus is superior to what these Jewish Christians have known before. And he is the high priest. He is now enthroned in heaven. He's seated at God's right hand, who now intercedes on behalf of God's people. So Hebrews, from chapter 4 verses 14 to chapter 10 verses 18, that's where our author explains the high priesthood of Jesus. And our textual unit now specifically is chapter 4 verses 14 to 16. That is Christ's high priesthood, an encouragement to his people. Just before our present textual unit, the author encourages these Christians to remain faithful, obtain the rest that God has promised for his people. And now, combined with that exhortation, there's also this positive encouragement. You can do this because you have Jesus as high priest now in heaven. Now, so let's go specifically to verses 14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. So we can hold fast to our confession. We have this Jesus who has passed through all the heavens. Now, in the Old Testament, the heavens was also often referred to in the plural. Around this time, or just before the time of early Christianity, there was also many apocalyptic type writings, and some could refer to 3 heavens or 7 heavens or even more. But the idea is here is that Jesus went through all the heavens, doesn't matter how many they are, and he's reached God, the throne. He's transcendent. So the emphasis here is on Jesus' transcendence. If we go to verses 15, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. So here's a combination of Jesus' absolute transcendence. Now, he's referred to as the great high priest, but also it does not negate his humanity. Jesus was a human being. We can still say he's still a human being who's now been raised from the dead. And let's go back to what the author also writes in chapter 2, verses 17. Well, let's go first to verse 14. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself, that's Jesus, likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death. And also in verse 17, therefore in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God. Then let's go on to verse 18. It says, for in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. So already earlier on the author writes, Jesus was a human being. He was like his brethren. He suffered, but he was also tempted. So he knows exactly what we are going through. So let's come back now to our textual unit. If you go read verse 14 again, or 15, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. Why? Because Jesus was human like us. He knows exactly what we are going through in our suffering, etc. So, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are. But now comes the important difference. Yet without sin. So Jesus was suffered like us, he was tempted like us, but he remained without sin. And now we come to our Bible word, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace. Because we have this high priest, Jesus in heaven, who can sympathize with us, who knows what we are going through, also that he has been exalted. Now he is transcendent. He is seated at the right hand of God. And he's our mediator, our intercessor now as a high priest. That's why we can come to him for help. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Because we can find this grace, we can find this help, because Jesus, the high priest, the one who's passed through all the heavens, who also was human like us, who understands our plight, he is there to help us.